Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry, and today we're going to be discussing scientism. So, what is scientism? Scientism is the belief that all truth is answered by science or the scientific method, that science is the arbiter of all truth. So, a lot of people in the modern world believe that. Although there are several problems with this philosophy, and yes, it is a philosophy, and it is a matter of epistemology. People of faith, especially Catholics, Christians abroad, cannot fall into this trap, although many do, because scientism relies strictly on the five senses. But the problem comes in, what about people who are born without five functioning senses? People who are blind have no discernment of images or color, but yet images and color are a reality. So therefore, there might be things in reality which are true that cannot be detected by the five senses. And you can make the same argument for someone who's born without hearing, speech, and so forth. So, the idea that our five senses can detect everything about reality, even the metaphysical, can be easily disproven philosophically. And then on the other hand, you have some people will say, well, Brian, you're not a scientist, so therefore your opinions about science, that they're not valid. Well, it's funny, those same people who say that often have disagreements with me in theology or psychology or things that I have a degree on, but yet somehow they still say I'm wrong in fields that they have no degree on and I do. So that argument is invalid. I don't have to be a scientist to make comments on science, or especially the philosophy of science. Because what is science? Science is knowledge. The scientific method has certain criteria that must be met in order to be truly scientific. Right? So in epistemology, that is the study of truth. How do we know what is true? I often instruct my children when they go to school and they learn things at school, if something sounds questionable, keep asking these questions. Who said so, and how do we know? So we keep asking the question, how do we know? Who said so? Because in addition to the five senses, we also have the intellect. The intellect has the ability to form abstract thoughts and ideas and logic. And sometimes the five senses aren't able to detect everything, especially when we get into metaphysics and the ideas of God, theology, questions of faith. And also, even with the natural sciences, with the five senses, there's still the issue of interpretation. So the data itself is objective, right? The things that we test or observe. But the interpretation has to be done by a human being, and human beings come with a set of assumptions about reality, what is true and what is not true already. And therefore, the interpretations have an element of subjectivity to them. So, for example, say in the field of paleontology, you have some obscure fossil that is discovered, and so the scientist who assumes like an evolutionary worldview will look at this unique fossil and say, aha, we've discovered the missing link. With somebody who doesn't have those assumptions coming into the equation will look at the same fossil and say, aha, we've discovered a new species that has become extinct, or something in that nature. So that's a very shallow example, but it is an example of the matter of interpretation and the assumptions going into the interpretation having a degree of subjectivity and therefore a margin of error in it. So what is science? Science is knowledge, right? So in order, to use the scientific method properly, you have to observe a phenomenon happening in its natural habitat, and you have to be able to test it in its natural habitat in order to come to a concrete scientific conclusion about it. So what about the things that we do not observe? That comes with a degree of faith. Everything that is not directly observed requires faith to believe it. Even if it was observed by previous scientists, then you have to have faith that their findings and their conclusions are accurate. Because if you yourself didn't do those tests, you have to believe that someone else did the test and they did it right. just because something is logical doesn't mean that it's true, right? You can come to a logical conclusion about something with all the premises being logical and sequential, but if one of the premises in the argument or the testing is false or has a degree of falsity in it, therefore the conclusion also has a degree of falsehood in it. So, and that's true. Like when, in court cases, a lawyer can make an argument. The conclusion might not necessarily be true if one of the premises in the argument is not true, even if it's logical. And the same goes with science. We might have scientists who come to a logical conclusion about something they're studying, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true because one of their assumptions or their premises in their method or their testing could be false, and that therefore the whole thing can be false. And anybody who's read any professional scientific journal will see that scientists disagree with each other all the time on these measures. So it's not like it's presented to you in the public like, oh, all scientists agree with such and such, and there should be an asterisk next to that. Let me give you an example. A few years back, I was watching Shark Week on the Discovery Channel, and when you watch these shows, these science-based shows, they sound so certain about everything they're presenting. At the end of one of these shows on Shark Week, they slipped up and they said, yes, but we've only really discovered 10% of the ocean. So, what that means is 90% of the ocean has yet to be discovered. So they're basing their so-called certain conclusions based on only 10% of the evidence being in. So that means there's a great degree of margin of error in what they've concluded so far because they've only had 10% of the data in. So, so much for science, so to speak. Right, let me give you another example of an assumption that is questionable at best. The theory of uniformity. The theory of uniformity is the belief that everything that we observe now, as far as the laws of physics and the laws of nature as we observe them now, have always remained constant throughout the entirety of the Earth's and really the universe's history. Now, how do you know that's true unless you've been around for the entirety of the Earth's and the universe's history? You cannot assume that everything we observe today has always occurred at the same rate and the same degree that we do observe it now. That's a great assumption. That the saying that the present is the key to the past, so to speak. I would actually argue for the opposite, that the past is the key to the present. So we've only been measuring, the laws of physics for a few hundred years, and then many of these scientific observations, such as climate, climate change being a hot button issue, have only been measured for 170 years or so. So how can you come to such conclusions about climate change and the Earth's history when you only have 170 years of data? So whether you believe the Earth is 6,000 years or 5 billion years, 170 years is still a very small sample to base that off of. But this episode is not about climate change. It's about scientism. That's just one small piece of the pie. Let me give you an example of where the theory of uniformity kind of falls on its face when you use methodological dating systems, such as the carbon-14 dating system. Right, so you find a fossil and apply the carbon-14 dating method on it, and that supposedly gives you an estimated date of the fossil. The problem is that carbon-14 dating, it has an assumption that the rate of decay of carbon-14 in the fossil has always remained constant throughout its history. So therefore, if you believe a fossil is millions of years old, the margin of error increases greatly the older the fossil is, because the rate of decay could have a greater degree of variability the further you go back in time. So what might affect the rate of decay in a fossil or of anything? Catastrophes. So like the theory of catastrophism having great impact on the Earth and the laws of physics, therefore, actually makes more sense. So things like volcanoes, ice ages, meteors and asteroids hitting the Earth, these things have shown to have a great impact the way things happen in science. For example, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in the early 1980s, it produced a great degree of sedimentary rock layers in a matter of hours. Whereas if you use the theory of uniformity, they say that each sedimentary rock layer occurred over millions or thousands of years, depending on which one it is. But, when you have something as sudden as a volcano happening, producing the same amount of sedimentary rock layer in a matter of minutes or hours, it really puts that theory, it really debunks it, because you actually observed that happening, whereas you didn't observe all the other rock layers happening. You're just assuming that, by the rates that we see sediments forming, with erosion and everything, that it takes millions of years for these rock layers to form, when that's not necessarily the case. If you have catastrophic events, floods, such as the Great Flood of Noah, or any other flood after that, tornadoes, hurricanes, any natural disaster with profound, in profound measure, can have a great effect, or can alter physical processes. So that really kind of brings in uniformity into question. And without the law of uniformity, or the theory of uniformity in place, a lot of scientific speculations about what has happened in the unobserved past are really just no more than faith in your systems, faith in your methods, faith on what other people say. So what's different between that kind of faith and religious faith? Nothing really, because religious faith requires a degree of faith or belief in what other people have said and what people have recorded, and so does science when you talk about the unobserved past. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to put science on the same playing field as religion, in a sense, because it requires faith in something you yourself have not observed. And just to be fair about the uniformity thing, I could also equally criticize young Earth creation scientists who also use that same assumption, because they also use the helium argument to argue that the Earth is young. So they'll say, well, we know that the rate of helium escapes certain rock formations and rocks at a certain level, and yet we see these rock formations have this amount of helium in it. Therefore, it can't be millions of years old, because we know helium escapes rock layers at a certain rate. And if these rock layers are 1 million years old, then there should be no helium left in them whatsoever. See, they're using the same false assumption that the old earthers or the Darwinists would use to come to their conclusion. So therefore, both of those conclusions are questionable. So I'm just trying to be fair. Okay, and another method that might be put in question is the geologic column, as far as rock layers and fossils. They often use circular reasons. So, for example, if you go to a geologist with a fossil and you say, well, how old is this fossil? So they'll go to their chart with the geologic column saying, well, these fossils are typically found in this rock layer, and we know that this rock layer is X amount of millions or thousands of years old. Therefore, this fossil is this many thousands or millions of years old. But then in turn you say, well, how do you know that these rock formations or these sedimentary layers are this millions or thousands of years old? And they'll say, well, we know that because we find these kind of fossils in these sedimentary rock layers. So you never really get to the bottom of it. It's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And then, if anything, they'll use the assumption of uniformity to assume that the rock layers in the geologic column is this age. And again, you don't know that for sure. You're just basing this off of your assumptions, which is faith. So all of this kind of, it really goes, it brings it into question, an equal footing, at least with faith. Whereas, at least with the Catholic faith, it's actually remained more constant than scientific theory, because the scientific theory, with each new discovery, you have to make modifications, whereas with the Catholic faith, you don't have to do that. So that brings us to our next topic of Darwinism, right? So Charles Darwin, 19th century scientist, when he went to he was actually going to go to seminary, but he actually decided to stop going there because of his discoveries in the I can't pronounce it very good, in the islands that he went to make his observations. All right, so is Darwinism compatible with Christianity? So Darwinism, first we should do a little background. Charles Darwin himself was not a Freemason, though his father was. So he was raised by a father who believed in the tenets of Freemasonry, and Freemasonry is highly deistic, meaning you believe in God, but God kind of created everything and let everything go into its natural processes. And a Freemason also doesn't believe in any kind of religious dogma. So that kind of plays into Darwin's scientific theories. So for Darwin, everything that happens in a closed system of cause and effect, right? So, and I also like to say, just make this concession that Christianity has no problem with microevolution, meaning that things adapt in their environment. Just wanted to make that clear. When I say Darwinism, I'm really putting more emphasis on macroevolution, meaning that one creature evolves into another, right? So for Darwinism, you kind of have the general consensus that in the beginning, everything kind of, or you could say God created it, even if you want to go with theistic evolution. And there was this big cosmic soup, and kind of everything. You had the single cell organisms, and it kind of evolved into more complex organisms, and eventually get to mammals, right? So a lot of this is just natural cause and effect over a great deal of time, which would be necessary for that to happen. And you need lots of death. So is that compatible with Christianity? So in Christianity, death is an enemy to be defeated. When God created everything and rested on the seventh day, he said it is very good. He declared it very good. There is no death. In fact, death did not come in to the creation in the biblical account until the fall and original sin of Adam and Eve, right? The fall. That's when death entered, right? Even St. Paul says that in Romans 5, that death entered through sin, the sin of Adam. But in the evolutionary model, Adam is the process of lots of death and ape-like ancestors evolving into man. So if you're trying to be a theistic evolutionist and be a Christian at the same time, you would have to say that Adam is the first fully evolved human, but there was lots of death and lots of mistakes that had to be worked out through the evolutionary process. And you see how that really contradicts the biblical account. Like, it wasn't until sin that everything came into being as far as death and decay. So, but with Darwinism, death and decay are necessary and actually good, because they actually produce the prototypical human eventually. But that's a blatant contradiction with the Bible. In order for Darwinism and evolution in general to be true, you kind of have to twist the arm of Scripture to make it fit into the scientific model. But as we've already observed, science requires a great deal of faith for many of the scientific conclusions to be true in the first place, and that's very questionable at best. So Darwinism also should be questionable, especially with the death thing. Actually, the Genesis account makes a lot more sense scientifically than Darwin's theory would even have it. So the first two laws of thermodynamics is actually explained in Genesis in the first 3 chapters, not in scientific language, but in theological language. For example, the first law of thermodynamics is that no matter or energy can be created, that everything is already here. So it's impossible to create matter or energy. So in Genesis 1, at the end of the chapter, it says that God rested, right? That means he stopped creating. So that is compatible with the first law of thermodynamics, and actually it's equivalent to it if you really think about it. The second law of thermodynamics is that everything decays over time, and things go from more complex to less complex. And that's compatible with Genesis chapter 3, with original sin. Because the consequence of original sin was that death enters into creation, where God promised Adam, if you eat the forbidden fruit, you will die. And in Genesis 3, Adam began to die. He didn't die on the spot, but he began to decay, right? So, and all matter, along with Adam, began to decay. As St. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, the entire creation, the entire cosmos is groaning in waiting its redemption of the sons of God. So, when Christ returns, he's going to restore all of creation to its, it's going to be a new creation, a new heaven, and a new earth. It's going to be like as it was before Adam sinned, right? So that's part of the redemption of Jesus Christ, is to return humanity to its original state in Adam, and actually even better than that, because Jesus, as the second Adam, is greater than the first Adam. So what does this have to do with science? True science is actually compatible with Genesis and the Bible and Christianity, and it's not so much compatible with Charles Darwin's theory. In fact, at the end of Darwin's Origin of Species, he says if there could be proven that any part of biology can be demonstrated to have not evolved from more simpler forms, then my theory would be debunked. I'm paraphrasing. That's what he's saying. So the idea that things go from less complex to more complex doesn't really fit with the second law of thermodynamics, because everything decays and kind of goes downhill. So those things are in great tension. And even Darwin confessed that there were things that were being studied at his time that were problematic to his theory, such as the complexity of the eyeball. All of these parts need to work correctly the first time, and they can't get better without them being correct in the first place. We can make several examples of this. This is actually called irreducible complexity, the idea that something has to be perfectly functional the first time, otherwise it dies, and dead things don't evolve. So an eyeball would be one example. Another example would be the childbirth in human beings. That's such a complex thing that happens as soon as the umbilical cord is cut, because before the child is born, he has to breathe and get all of its nutrients from the mother. So once the umbilical cord is cut, the baby's lungs, the air sacs of the lungs are filled with oxygen for the first time it takes its first breath, and there's a certain valve in the heart that has to close. And if that doesn't work all correctly the first time, then the baby dies and it can evolve, right? And even the simplest single-celled organism is a complex factory that everything has to be functioning right the first time in order for it to survive and eat other single-celled organisms to evolve. So that's like the idea of atheism is kind of ridiculous in that sense, because I think someone said it like the chances of a single-celled organism evolving by chance is something like 1 in 200 with 30 zeros after it. So let's say over millions of years or billions of years that happened by chance, but then it has to eat another single-celled organism to survive. So then you have to square that, and it has to keep eating in order for it not to die and for it to reproduce. So the probability of that happening by chance it's miraculous, literally speaking. And that idea also is in contradiction with Darwin's theory, because a single cell organism is very complex by nature, and all the parts have to be functioning right the first time. Right. So Darwinism also contradicts the philosophical idea that you can't give what you don't have. Right. So an organism cannot produce that which is not already built into it. Or I can't give you $20 if I only have $10. Right? It would have to, in theory, combine with other organisms, have to come along, and they kind of have to add material to it in order for that to even be theoretically possible. And that's just that actually adds to the complexity of nature, rather than Darwin's theory of going from simple to greater. The reality seems to be that everything was great, and then it kind of devolved, or it got more simpler or less complex over time, with death and disease and decay, bringing more problems. And mutations are generally things that are harmful to the creature and not ordered to its survival. And that actually makes more sense if you take the idea of original sin in the Bible, that death entered the world through sin. And then also the problem with Darwinism as a philosophy, and really it's a speculative philosophy. It's not really a science because, like we've already discussed, you can't observe things happening. Like the fossil record actually supports the Bible and Christianity better because you have no creatures, no fossils in the fossil record, and all of a sudden, boom, you have virtually all creatures in the fossil record being discovered almost immediately. But when you take the philosophy of Darwinism and then you apply it to religion and you apply it to sociology, then you kind of have this idea of an upward evolutionary state. Like things are constantly getting better. Man is constantly getting more intelligent and more smart and more more illumined, and that's obviously false. I mean, we have more access to resources than we've ever had in the past, but if you think about it, ancient peoples did a lot of great architectural building and built societies and civilizations with much fewer resources than we have. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have a library. They had to build that over time, but yet they were building pyramids and complex buildings and ships, and they did great things with far fewer resources. So that's a problem with kind of the social Darwinism idea. And then when it gets into the religious field, then we have the idea of, well, we used to believe that to be true back then, back in the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, but now we're more evolved and more enlightened, and now the truth is evolving, But that contradicts the idea that God is immutable and eternal and unchanging. If God said something was immoral, 1,000 years ago, it's still immoral today. We haven't evolved past that because God is perfect. He's eternal. He doesn't change. So the idea that God or that truth changes and evolves and that everything in the earth changes and evolves, that's actually a form of pantheism, because that also assumes that God has to evolve along with his creation. And that actually assumes that God is actually a part of his creation, that he's not outside of it. He's not transcendent. And that's highly problematic as far as the traditional Christianity and Catholicism and the Bible is concerned. And that's why, as Christians, we should ultimately reject Darwinism, not only because of its Freemasonic origins, as far as him being raised by a Freemason and in being a deist, but the idea that we can assume that everything occurs just as we observe it today scientifically, it just takes more faith to believe that than does it believe the teachings of the Catholic Church or the teachings of Christianity. And then that's a solid Christian position, and that's scientifically sound, because as we've discussed, science is knowledge, and you can only know things by observation and by testing it. And so if you can't test it, you can only believe it by faith. If you can't observe it directly, it takes faith to believe it, even if you put the stamp of science and the scientific method on it. And even if it's logically possible, using deductive logic, you still can only believe it by faith. Therefore, scientism is limited. The scientific method, rather, is limited, and scientism as a philosophy, we must reject it, being true Christians. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen.